Welcome to the Max Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast. This is episode 116. This is Lex at maxfuture.com, and this is the Apple Podcast. And this is a chit-chat-free podcast all about Apple, Apple news, Apple products, Apple applications, anything sort of Apple-related. And, it's the audio version of this is commercial-free, and there's a video version of this on YouTube and on Blip TV, and also on the Apple iTunes Store under just Apple, whatever, Apple stuff or Apple Talk. Just look for Max Future and you'll find it. So you can help out this podcast by giving it any sort of positive review in the iTunes Store or on YouTube or on Blip TV, or go to maxfuture.com and, read that blog. So let's get to it. There's a lot of Apple-related news. Today is Sunday, May 27th, 2012. Okay, so one of the more interesting stories relating to Apple is Apple filed a response to, I guess it filed a motion to dismiss to the lawsuit brought by the Justice Department against Apple and various book publishers, claiming, that Apple and the book publishers engaged in antitrust violations. I spotted this first on Fortune. Philip Elmer DeWitt in his Apple 2.0 had a nice little story. His story was entitled "Apple to DOJ Bite Me," and basically he points out that Apple has come out blasting and attacking the Justice Department's claims that Apple engaged in antitrust violations. Apple's calling the DOJ's case against Apple, quote, absurd, end quote, fundamentally flawed, end quote, end quote, end quote. And so it's basically, here's a screenshot. Here is the Apple's brief against DOJ. It's actually Apple's answer to the complaint. And so in the preliminary statement, Apple really sets out its defense. An answer to a complaint is just a paragraph by paragraph response to the allegations of the complaint. How do you plead? And this is a civil case, not a criminal case. So let me read to you what Apple writes. This is key. Apple writes, "The government's complaint against Apple is fundamentally flawed as a matter of fact and law. Apple has not conspired with anyone, was not aware of any alleged conspiracy by others, and never fixed prices. Apple individually negotiated bilateral agreements with book publishers that allowed it to enter and compete in a new market segment, ebooks. The iBookstore offered its customers a new, outstanding, innovative ebook reading experience, an expansion of categories and titles of ebooks, and competitive prices. The government sides with monopoly rather than competition in bringing this case. The government starts from the false premise that an ebooks market was characterized by robust price competition prior to Apple's entry. This ignores a simple and uncontrovertible fact. Before 2010, there was real no competition. There was only Amazon. At the time Apple entered the market, Amazon sold nearly 9 out of every 10 ebooks, and its power over price and product selection was nearly absolute. Apple's entry spurred tremendous growth in ebook titles, range, and variety of offerings, sales, and improved quality of the ebook reading experience. This is evidence of a dynamic competitive market. These inconvenient facts are ignored in the complaint. Instead, the government focuses on increased prices for a handful of titles. The complaint does not allege that all ebook prices, or even most ebook prices, increased after Apple entered the market. The government alleges that Apple conspired to eliminate retail price competition. This is absurd. Nothing Apple did reduced competition or fixed prices. As an agent, Apple did not set prices, nor did Apple have an interest in higher prices for ebooks. Indeed, Apple negotiated two limits on publisher pricing, maximum prices to make sure electronic books cost considerably less than physical books, and the right to require a publisher to match in the iBookstore a lower competitive price on new release titles being offered elsewhere. The price matching term allowed exceptions for promotions, was not rigidly self-executing, and encouraged, not discouraged, competition, as publishers' respective titles could directly compete at retail against each other on the merits, including price. Apple's entry has benefited customers. Apple's entry brought competition where none existed. Amazon still has a dominant share in ebook and physical distribution. With significant power, it often leverages over the producers and consumers of books to the detriment of both. But prior to Apple's entry, Amazon effectively stood alone and unchallenged. No longer. Amazon is now forced to compete with Apple, Barnes & Noble, and others. And the pace of innovation has quickened, enticing more and more consumers to try ebooks. Apple introduced a number of innovative features such as color pictures, audio and video, the read and listen feature, and fixed display, critical for graphics-intensive books like cookbooks, travel books, and textbooks, many of which were unavailable before Apple's entry. As a result, as even the government is compelled to admit, output has exploded. Consumers enjoy vastly increased choice. Amazon has had to compete and innovate beyond its small black and white e-reader, enriching the experience for consumers across all platforms. Apple offered any publisher interested in the iPad platform and iBookstore the ability to sell its ebooks directly to consumers, rather than dealing only with the single dominant buyer, Amazon. It offered ebook consumers who had no interest in owning a Kindle e-reader a new platform to obtain and read ebooks. Apple's entry also provided new opportunities for self-publishing and smaller publishing houses. Apple is not privy to Amazon's motivations when it adopted the agency model, but enabling entry and introducing new competition, which is all Apple did, cannot be a violation of antitrust laws. And then it goes on to say, the Supreme Court has made clear that the antitrust laws are not a vehicle for government intervention in the economy to impose its view of the, quote, best, end quote, competitive outcome or the, quote, optimal, end quote, means of competition, but rather to address anti-competitive conduct. Apple's entry into ebook distribution is classic pro-competitive conduct, and for Apple to be subject to hindsight legal attack for a business strategy well recognized as perfectly proper sends the wrong message to the market and will discourage competitive entry and innovation and harm consumers. So that's a pretty powerful statement by Apple. So it sounds like, Apple believes that it has significant merit in its defense of the Justice Department's antitrust case. Philip de Elmer Wood points out that Apple maybe is throwing the other booksellers under the bus because Apple's just saying that Apple did not engage in any collective negotiation with the booksellers, but it's not, going into whether or not the booksellers talking among themselves engaged in any misconduct. So this is very interesting, and I think Apple's going to put up a real defense, I guess, in fighting the charges by the Justice Department. So we'll have to watch. Well, Friday, May 25th was a kind of a happy day for a certain segment of iPhone, iPad, and iPod Touch users because it was Jailbreak Day. And what do I mean by Jailbreak Day? Well, the way it works, Apple upgrades the hardware to the iOS devices and upgrades the software, and that then breaks the ability of certain jailbreak programs to jailbreak the iPhone or iPad or iPod Touch. And the latest version of Apple's iOS operating system is 5.1.1. And up till this past Friday, the community of people who are into jailbreaking weren't able to jailbreak the iPhone or iPad. So if you had a new iPad, a third generation iPad, you could not jailbreak it. And if you had upgraded to iOS 5.1.1 on the iPad 2 or the iPhone 4S and such, you are not able to jailbreak it. And why would you want to jailbreak it? And let me just say, jailbreaking is legal. The Copyright Office basically said that you can jailbreak your iPhone and iPad. And what does jailbreaking mean? Well, jailbreaking means that getting around Apple's restrictions that you can only buy apps or install apps either from Apple's App Store on your iOS device, or if you save a web app just from your browser. And Apple doesn't allow you to like install like a third-party store, and because Apple likes to approve applications that are run on the iPhone and vet them. And so some of them are for technical reasons. Apple doesn't want you to have a bad experience on the iPhone or iPad. Apple doesn't want like programs sort of messing around with the guts of the operating system and causing your iPhone or iPad to crash. But also Apple has a business reason. Apple may want certain apps that it creates to be the exclusive apps that work on the iPhone or iPad. And so they, Apple might reject an app that, let's say duplicates a function like the phone calling function. But some people who are more adventurous, and there's a big community of people who want to get more out of their iPad or iPhone, are into jailbreaking. And what jailbreaking does is it finds a way around Apple's restrictions and installs a third-party app store on your iPhone, iPad, or iPod Touch. And the most prominent third-party app store is a store called Cydia, Cydia. And so when you jailbreak it, Cydia is installed on your iPhone or iPad, and then you can get some apps that otherwise might not be sold through Apple's App Store. For me, the most significant app is an app that allows you to do video screen recording natively on the iPhone or iPad. Like on a computer, you can screen record your computer screen using software on a Mac like Camtasia, or even Apple's own QuickTime program allows you to screen record. And that's good for tutorials. It's a great educational device, because by screen recording, you can show someone how to like run a program or how to fix a problem with your computer. And I like to do like tutorials on, reviews of new apps and games and stuff like that on the iPhone or iPad. And Apple doesn't allow a screen recorder on those devices. I think Apple doesn't allow them because Apple doesn't think the hardware can really run something as powerful as a screen recorder. And so I jailbreak the iPhone or iPad to run this great screen recorder called Display Recorder that's by a developer named Ryan Petrick. It costs like, I don't know, like $5 or $3 or $4, something like that. So anyways, people have been waiting, and according to lifehacker.com, I'm looking at a website here, on Friday, a group called the Chronic Dev Team released its jailbreak tool called Absinthe 2.0, ABSINTH 2.0. And basically you just download this program, and you make sure that you're running iOS 5.1.1 on your iDevice, and then you just run the program, and it finds your connected, by USB connected iDevice, and it basically jailbreaks it. Now, so I did it to both my iPad 3 and my third generation iPad and my iPhone 4S. One thing that I noticed is that some jailbreak devices haven't yet, some jailbreak apps like Ryan Petrick's Display Recorder haven't yet been upgraded to work on the third generation iPad. So that one isn't yet working. I guess it's because of the Retina screen. That's a lot of video to sort of record. But I'm kind of happy about the jailbreak being up. I personally think that Apple doesn't mind having the jailbreakers around, because it allows for real innovation to happen, and some of the more cutting-edge apps are developed by the Jailbreak community, and then Apple incorporates those features and future upgrades of Apple's iOS. So, for example, actually, I think the first jailbreaks just installed apps for Apple, because remember, Apple didn't have an app store when the iPhone first generation came out, and I think it was the Jailbreak community that provided the first apps. But then things like cut and paste, I think, was implemented by the jailbreakers before it was implemented by Apple. So I think Apple gets the best of both worlds, by having jailbreakers. On one hand, for people, for the masses who get an iPhone and don't jailbreak it, they're sort of living in a safe environment where Apple can vet the apps. And but by having a jailbreak community, Apple can appease the sort of more cutting edge users who push the envelope and can see what kind of new features make sense. I mean, if you think about it, it's the ultimate beta lab for Apple, because Apple can see, hey, look, the jailbreakers have created all these apps that do more powerful things on the iPhone and iPad, and they seem to be working well and not crashing. That means that the iPad and the iPhone hardware can handle it. So it's sort of like Apple having a huge pool of testers, for testing all sorts of new features. So I think it's great. And if you want to do this, you could lose your data, you could brick your iPhone or iPad, but in the past I found, like, I once bricked my iPad 2, I think, or my first generation iPad, and I just brought it to the Apple store. I didn't say how. I just said, oh, something happened. Maybe when I was backing it up, I unplugged the UBS, and they just reset it. They have a machine that can reset it. This is all just software, so it's not really going to damage your device. So anyways, if you're interested in checking out sort of alternative apps and tweaking your iPhone or iPad, you may consider jailbreaking it. So this, I think, past week, Dell Computers announced that it wasn't doing so well, and that its netbook market really took a hit. And basically, Dell sort of indicated it was because of the iPad. Didn't say the word iPad. But over at the Asimco blog, Horace Daydew, who's great at sort of analyzing data and creating sort of nifty charts, has a really good post on May 23rd entitled "The PC Market Overview from Quarter 1." And basically he shows the kind of impact that we have by the Mac and the iPad on the PC market. And so he has a chart here, and the chart says, in terms of units, window-based computers made up 78% of all PCs sold in Quarter 1. That was an increase from the 74% in the previous quarter, but a decline from 90% a year ago. And it goes on to say OS X-based computers were about 3.7%, a decline in share, both quarter to quarter and year to year, something the company attributed to a transition quarter. And then he shows that the following chart shows the composition of vendor volumes with table and traditional form factors of computers included. And you see that really, if there's any sort of growth, it's really because of the Mac and the iPad, and then some other tablets like the Amazon Fire, the Samsung Galaxy Tab. So he points out that iOS computers were 11% of the market, declining from 13% last quarter, but increasing from Quarter 1 in 2011, 4.2% share. And he points out that Apple could have sold even more iPads. So basically, he concludes that overall Apple remained the top vendor if you count tablets with regular computers, with a market share of 14.6%, followed by HP with 14.1% and Lenovo at 10.7%. And it says that Dell barely managed to beat out Acer at 9%. So the key is, should we consider iPads to be part of the overall computer market? And I think that we should. I think a lot of people are now using iPads as replacements for things like laptops. I mean, there's a lot of people whose basic computer needs are to do some basic word processing, some web surfing, and some emailing and some texting. And then you throw on top of that all the stuff that you can do with the iPad. I think it's fair to include the iPad as a, when you're looking and evaluating computer market share. So good job, Horace. I mean, I really love his website. Okay, so over at Fortune, there's a writer named Adam Lashinsky, and he wrote actually a little book about Apple and how they do business, and so he knows a lot about Apple and the inner workings of the business. And he wrote actually a good article about Apple on May 24th entitled "How Tim Cook is Changing Apple." And basically the point of his article is that Tim Cook is really not, trying to copy Steve Jobs, exactly in management style, that he does things differently. And the overall gist is that he's more flexible and more accessible and easy. I don't know, it just seems to be more like a cheerleader. So this is kind of interesting, because the question is, what was he going to do after Steve Jobs passed away? Is he going to be different? And so here's an interesting thing that he says, Lashinsky. He says, here's what's most remarkable about Cook's appearance that day last winter. This is at an event. He says, Steve Jobs wouldn't have bothered. The legendary company co-founder who stepped down as Apple CEO last August, 6 weeks before his death, rarely deigned to meet with investors. Apparently, Tim Cook met at a investor conference and spoke to people. It goes on to say, that was one of Tim Cook's tasks as chief operating officer. It's a subtle but significant change. Investors now have the CEO's ear for the first time in years, and it's one of many. It's one of many Cook has instituted at Apple as he approaches his one-year mark at the helm. Taken together, his report with Wall Street as well as government officials, his decision to grant a dividend to shareholders, the creation of a program to match employees' gift to charity, Tim Cook's stewardship of Apple is beginning to come into focus. So basically, he's doing things different. I mean, he did start this charity program where Apple matches gifts to charity by employees. Steve Jobs was never really into that, and he didn't think it really made sense. But I think Tim Cook is not just an operations person, but he also is sensitive to PR. I mean, he really went in a nice way on the offensive with all the criticism about Foxconn and stuff like that. So I think he is doing stuff differently, and Lashinsky's article really says that. He points out that behind the scenes there are indications of where Apple is leading, where Cook is leading Apple. He says typical of these changes play to the new CEO's background and strengths. Cook is the master of operational efficiency, having joined Apple in 1998 to revamp its badly broken system of factories, warehouses, and suppliers. And he goes on, Lashinsky said that it was a personal blow to Cook when the New York Times ran, those articles basically citing the working conditions at Foxconn. Lashinsky says Cook's response marked a distinct change in the tone from Jobs, who had been dismissive of the severity of the problem. The new CEO not only visited Foxconn personally, he also allowed himself to be photographed doing so. And it goes on to say Apple also joined the Fair Labor Association. Apple clearly is under a different stewardship. The question is, can he really propel Apple to the success it had under Steve Jobs? Now, he was a big part of that success. He was the genius really behind the production abilities of Apple, and the ability of Apple to have low inventory, and also to outsource the production, and also to make enough stuff to sell. But the question is he, is his management style going to be innovative enough? And for that, I mean, that's something that's going to be very difficult to say, because you have to imagine the biggest value that really Steve Jobs, I think, gave to Apple was that he understood the products, and he understood what was sexy, and Steve Jobs understood how to give people something they didn't even know they wanted and bring them into the future. And maybe it's a bad thing if Tim Cook really cares so much about what investors want, because investors aren't innovators, right? Investors don't know which way a product is going to go or how to grow a company. Investors don't make bold business decisions. And so Steve Jobs didn't really care about investors. I mean, he was already fabulously rich. Steve Jobs cared about winning, about being innovative, about going down in history as like a great technology innovator. I think to a large extent, Steve Jobs was fueled by his competition with people like Bill Gates, who was the same age as him, and who also helped found the modern personal computer. And, he was really about pushing the envelope, and he loved the gadgets. And that's the thing about Tim Cook. Do we know that he loves the gadgets? Does Tim Cook like pal around with Johnny Ive, who makes the designs? Does he sit around with him and saying, hey, what do you got? That's great. And is he really sort of down to earth, and into the cool, sexy stuff? Now, Tim Cook, he strikes me as sort of being a great management operations guy who seems to have an incredibly hard work ethic, but also he seems to have a softer personality than Steve Jobs, less acerbic, less someone who's got a outwardly volatile temper. My sense is Tim Cook probably does have a temper, but it's a much more sort of controlled business person-like temper. While Steve Jobs is more like, his temper seems to have been more the temper of somebody with, who's artistic volatility. Steve Jobs, to me, to the extent he, behaved with a temper, he probably did so, like Picasso did. While, Tim Cook is more like, the temper that maybe Jack Welch at General Motors, General Electric had. So anyways, I'll have a link to this article. It's a very long article and interesting to read, so check it out. Okay, so the Worldwide Developers Conference is really just 2 weeks away, June 11th, Monday it starts, and there's probably going to be a lot of stuff announced that day. And one thing that could be announced that day are, maybe additional features that are in OS X Mountain Lion, which is the beta version of the next operating system for the Macintosh. And 9to5Mac had an interesting article. Apparently some people who've been poking around the beta of Mountain Lion have discovered some stuff in there that indicates that that there's going to be Siri-like voice dictation coming to Mountain Lion. And 9to5 writes, voice is Apple's next important field of computer input, and Siri on the iPhone 4S and voice dictation on the 3rd generation iPad makes this clear. Then it goes on to say, however, Apple has brought a component of Siri called Dictation to the iPad, and the company appears to be planning on bringing this dictation feature to the Mac as well. And it says, according to resource file inside of the latest build of Safari in the newest seed of the upcoming OS X Mountain Lion, dictation might be making its way to the Macs next, since Macs do not sport virtual keyboards or physical keyboards with a microphone key, users will apparently need to simultaneously click both command keys to start voice input. So they have a screenshot here of this so-called resource file, and they go on to say, we are yet to find any other dictation references in OS X Mountain Lion beta, so we're keeping dictation in OS X Mountain Lion as unconfirmed until Apple officially announces it. And then it goes on to say, the apparently forthcoming feature is not functional in the current beta, with voice features being exclusive to certain devices in Apple's iOS device portfolio. Perhaps dictation is tied directly to certain Macs. Maybe the new MacBook Pros with Retina display, faster processors, thinner form factors, and USB 3 connectivity. So that's kind of interesting. And I mean, I do think that we're going to have Siri-like voice dictation in the Macs. I use the voice dictation in the third generation iPad all the time, and I really like it. It's good for, you know, short emails or dictating some text messages using iMessage, and I use it in the iPhone 4S too. So it could be a great feature of an upgraded Macintosh or MacBook Pros or iMacs. It would be kind of cool if Apple also came out with a new keyboard that had a microphone built into it, or a button to start the dictation. So it's very exciting. I think that's going to be one of the big features of the next hardware, personally. Okay, so one of the cool new features that I guess is going to be in Mountain Lion is there's going to be support for offline reading in Safari for the reader function. Like if you're looking at a screenshot of this, I'm actually running Mountain Lion Safari, so you know you can save articles using the reader button, you know, for saving links, and that's in the sort of side of Safari. But before, you had to be connected to read the stories. Now here, I'm unconnected. I have no internet connection. And see, look, I saved some links, and they're saved for offline reading. So here, Mac Rumors he's got the story. And if I click to some other part, see, it says you're not connected to the internet. But if I go back, that article that I saved in my sort of reader list is there. So look, I've got some other stories here. They're all saved. Now, it's a little buggy, though, because I'm noticing these artifacts. So, for example, if I go to, you know, this article about offline reading, let's see, where is that? Here it is. Wait, where it is? At Apple. Geez, I can't find it. But I noticed some artifacts, like with some, like pictures of, you know, ads that didn't go away and they're sort of stuck on it. So maybe they're still tweaking it. But, you know, it's an interesting upgrade for Mountain Lion and Safari. Now, this could impact Apple's move to have offline reading in its reader function in Safari. Could impact third-party apps. In particular, there's a great third-party service and app called Instapaper by Marco Arment, who runs marco.org blog and is on 5by5 as a podcaster. And his app, which I've been using for a long time, is $4.99, and it works great with a free online account you get from Instapaper, and basically allows you to save, using a bookmark function, stories to Instapaper for offline reading in your Instapaper app. So if Apple, presumably, if it's going to have offline reading on Safari on the Macintosh, it's also going to have offline reading in the reader function in Safari on the iPad and the iPhone. And that will cut into Instapaper into some way, you'd think, because instead of buying the app, you're going to have this free function in Safari. However, I've listened to Marco Arment talk about this on his podcast, and he points out it might get more people interested in the offline reader function, and then Instapaper is actually superior in function to what Apple's going to implement. For example, right now in Mountain Lion, yeah, you can save articles in Safari for offline reading, but you can't really group them into different, folders and such. They're just basically linearly there. And in Instapaper, you can create your own folders and organize stuff, and it's a great research tool too. For example, you can save a lot of articles and then organize them in your Instapaper app. But also, Instapaper has a function where it can you can follow the stories in Twitter that your friends link to, and that'll feed into the Instapaper. And also, Instapaper has the function where it can have featured stories and has sort of a curated feed of great stories. So Instapaper is a lot more than this function by Safari that is coming in Mountain Lion, and probably will come in iOS 6 for iPhone and iPad. But that's the thing about Apple. Apple sometimes takes what functions that third-party developers have and incorporates them into its own operating system. Okay, so one of the persistent rumors coming out is that Apple is going to enlarge the screen of the iPhone from 3.5 inches to 4 inches, or just under 4 inches. And there's been some speculation as to how Apple's going to go about doing that, because it could be very disruptive to app developers, because there's a certain pixel amount that goes into each iPhone or iPhone Retina display app. And it could be kind of disruptive to go to a different screen size. And, right now the aspect ratio is 3:2, and it could go to 16:9, which is what you get on a lot of high-definition TVs. So John Gruber had an article entitled "How Apple Could Play the Bigger Display iPhone Thing at WWDC," which I swear I'm still not convinced is for real. But you're getting to the point where there's an awful lot of smoke for there not to be fire, so let's run with it. So his point is that, the next iPhone is probably not going to come out till October, right? That's when the last iPhone came out. On the other hand, you have to get developers ready for this transition, so that when you go to the new iPhone, the apps will work on it. On the other hand, you can't really publicly announce you're going to have a new iPhone in October. I mean, everyone sort of knows it, but when you do a massive announcement that you're having one, it's going to could slow down sales of the current iPhone 4S. So there's a tension there. So what do you do? And John Gruber's got a good point. You could sort of coax developers at WWDC, which starts in 2 weeks, to sort of start designing their apps in a way so that they'll work with a new 4-inch display that is 16:9. And he's very clever in what John Gruber says. He basically points out that already in the iPhone, you do have the ability to sort of flexibly change and squeeze the display and enlarge it. So, for example, he points out that when you have apps that run in background. Let's say you have the voice dictation app going, right? The voice memos. Well, when you launch that and you start recording, if you then go out of it, you'll still have this large recording bar in red above your screen. And what John Gruber pointed out is that the iOS operating system just naturally squeezes the icons on the home screen springboard down a little bit to fit in the smaller real estate. So his point is that if it can squeeze in that direction, why can't it squeeze in the other direction? And basically, developers who have their app work with this function can have the app sort of squeeze to fit in when you have this you're using the phone function or the recording function. So he basically says Apple could basically at WWDC could tell developers that the reason they wants them to like tweak their apps is not for like a new iPhone, but for better banner displays of notification, so that you could stack them and stuff like that, like similar to what Palm's WebOS had. So that's an interesting theory. I mean, because it could serve two functions, to have this sort of tweaking of the apps to allow this sort of squeezing of extra space or expanding of extra space. And maybe that's a way for Apple to sort of sell it and to coax developers to get their apps ready for a new iPhone without saying a new iPhone is coming. Now, the other point that he makes is, what are you going to do with the extra space? And he points out that some people have been saying that the app switching function that you have in the current iPhone could be like permanently put in the extra space on the bottom. He points out, like, for example, that's the function when you double click the home button, you get this row of apps and then you can switch of them. And he basically, and I think John Gruber's correct, he says that's ridiculous that Apple would do that, to have that row of switchable apps in a persistent state at the bottom, because if they're there and you accidentally touch it, it could launch another app. And so you don't want to accidentally launch other apps, so you don't want them there in this sort of persistent state. Like on a computer, you do have like these apps on the side, but you're not going to accidentally launch them by clicking the mouse. But when you're holding an iPhone in your pocket and your hand, or you're more likely to accidentally launch an app that is in a persistent state open in the dock. So he makes a really good point about that. And what's his final point? He says, what are they going to go to 16 by 9? And I don't know. I think they will go to 16 by 9. It's a better video form factor. A lot of the YouTube videos are in 16 by 9, and I think they'll play better in that way. But anyways, John Gruber makes good points. Okay, so another thing that happened this week is that Apple and Samsung held its court-ordered mediation talks, and I'm looking at the Verge.com that reported on it. And basically, they didn't, I didn't expect there to be any sort of resolution, but it says that they weren't able to find common grounds. And the Verge article says a court-ordered mediation session between the CEOs of Apple and Samsung appears to have gone for naught, producing no breakthroughs in the ongoing patent litigation between the two industry giants. Despite Tim Cook and Joe Gi-sung being in the same room, they ultimately reached, quote, no clear agreement, end quote, reports the Korea Times. And then it says, according to Foss patents, minute orders filed by Judge Spiro revealed that Apple and Samsung met for 9 hours on Monday and 7 hours yesterday, but don't mention any results of the mediation sessions. The dispute is now slated to enter the trial phase in July. The Verge says it would seem Tim Cook's distaste for litigation, the chief executive said last month he preferred to settle versus battle, lost out to Apple's longstanding desire to see competitors, quote, invent their own stuff, end quote. For its part, Samsung has acknowledged heading into the proceedings that a, quote, big gap, end quote, remained between both parties. Both mentioned cross-licensing as a potential solution to what has become a global confrontation. With mediation settlement talks now behind them, the courtroom is likely to be the final venue of the patent war, assuming Judge Koh doesn't order Apple and Samsung back for additional discussions. Now, the thing is, court-ordered mediation doesn't mean that the parties have to come to some out-of-court settlement. It's just a device that judges use to try to get the parties to settle, but ultimately the parties have the final right to decide not to settle. And, I would think, I didn't think that mediation would work here because, Apple and Samsung already had a close relationship. Samsung is a gigantic provider of parts for Apple's devices. I mean, billions of dollars of processors and chips and whatnot. And yet, Apple was in litigation with Samsung and couldn't resolve the issue. And instead, Samsung is appearing to try to compete head-on in the design of tablets and smartphones with Apple. So I wasn't surprised that they didn't, come to some sort of agreement. Really, what kind of agreement would they have come to? I mean, Apple wants them to create devices that look vastly different than the current iPhone and iPad. And on the other hand, Samsung knows it's in its business interest to have knockoffs that look as close to the devices as possible. So how do you negotiate that? And I think the real test for any settlement is going to be on the eve of trial. The trial is going to be in July. And if one party, let's say Samsung, feels it's going to have a lot to lose in a jury trial, it may then try to cut a deal by modifying what maybe what Samsung will do is agree to heavily modify the way its future devices look and also pay Apple a licensing fee for using certain designs. So I'm not surprised. It's a very nasty litigation, and we'll have to see what happens at the July trial. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is, what Apple should do in terms of its strategic future as it comes to social media. And why do I say that? Because, right now we had, some big events, right? Facebook went public last Friday. Now, when its IPO didn't do so well, it started off at $38. That was the IPO price, and it went up to maybe $41. But by the end of the day, Monday, it was down to like, $32 a share. And the thing is, social media is huge. I find I'm using several social media tools. I use Facebook really just for family and close friends. I use Google Plus for my blogging stuff, as my my Max Future stuff. I use Tumblr, which hosts my blog Max Future, which is also sort of social media because you can follow other Tumblrs. And of course, I use Twitter, and I'm a Max Future under Twitter, and I use that heavily. And social media is kind of a strategic area for the future of the web. I mean, I use it in so many different ways. Like my Twitter feed, is linked to all these apps, and I get all these news feeds via Twitter. And then Google Plus is a tremendous communication tool. There's this thing now, Google Plus Hangouts on Air, which is tremendous. You can do a hangout, a video hangout with 10 or so people, and the video camera will switch amongst everyone, and you can broadcast that now live to everyone in the world through this Google Hangouts on Air feature. And on top of that, the video will be saved, and it will go to YouTube. Now, Apple has some sort of social media, but it's not really taking off, right? And I'll get to my point about Twitter. I think Apple should buy Twitter. Twitter's a private company, and Apple already has a strategic alliance with Twitter because Twitter is now baked into iOS 5, and it's integrated into all sorts of parts of the operating system. And I think also it's in Mountain Lion. It's going to be integrated into Mountain Lion so that you're going to be able to tweet, from Safari easily. You're going to be able to tweet from applications and have applications, tap into your Twitter account, which is part of the settings now of iOS 5. And why should Apple buy Twitter? On one hand, Apple's model as a hardware provider is, let's just make hardware that works with different software, and then we make the money on the hardware, and then service providers, whether they be Facebook or Google or Twitter or whoever, they can use our platform, but we're not competing with them. On the other hand, no, Apple faces strategic threats from social networks like Google Plus and Facebook. Because, for example, let's say Facebook decides to create their own hardware, right? Like a Facebook tablet, like similar to Amazon creating the Kindle Fire, right? So some people might decide to buy a Facebook tablet because everything they do is Facebook related. Let's say the videos they post, the photos they share, and the things they buy. And Facebook also has an API, like for selling apps through Facebook. So it's very possible that, Facebook could compete with Apple by having hardware. And then if Facebook becomes really big and Facebook has its hardware, Facebook could put the screws on Apple by saying, well, what if we pull Facebook compatibility with Apple's iPhone or iPad or the apps that run on it that use Facebook? Well, then that could be a harm to, selling iPhones or iPads. Similarly, there's a lot of Google features in the iPhone and iPad, right? There's Google Maps, there's YouTube, and as more and more people start using Google services that are all now being integrated, like Google Docs, Google Plus, Hangouts on Air, there is a threat that people will leave Apple's hardware if Google pulls the plug from the hardware. Now, that's sort of like thermonuclear war, because if Google pulls the plug, then they lose a lot of eyeballs. So, but on the other hand, to be safe when your enemies have nuclear weapons, you need to have your own nuclear weapons. And so Apple, I do think, needs to be tapped into a robust and vibrant social network. And it's already very close with Twitter through Twitter integration. And Apple could really, have a vibrant social network by buying Twitter and further integrating it. And so, for example, Twitter recently purchased Posterous, which is a blogging platform and sort of like Tumblr that hadn't been as successful as Tumblr. Now, I use Posterous to host my audio feeds for the iPad podcast and the Apple podcast. And so it's I can see why Twitter bought Posterous, because one of the limitations of Twitter is that it's just 140 character posts and links, right? And maybe some photo sharing too, right? Because you can tweet photos and maybe some videos, but you can't really host them in any one spot. But what if Twitter expands using Posterous and gives everybody Posterous, Tumblr, blogging connected to their Twitter tweets? For example, what if you could have a feature where all your photo tweets that you sent through Twitter automatically go to a photo gallery that's Posterous hosted? Or, for example, what if certain saved tweets or marked tweets could be collected as sort of an ongoing text summary on your blog? So you could see that coming. But then if Apple buys a Twitter that's also integrated with Posterous, Apple could then integrate that with its iCloud service, so that your emails there and your videos and your, so would Twitter agree to be bought by Apple? I think the chances, in the past, maybe the people who run Twitter, who founded it, maybe they didn't want to buy by Apple because Apple wasn't going to offer enough money to buy Twitter. Maybe the people who created Twitter wanted, $100 billion or $50 billion. But Facebook's IPO may have increased Apple's leverage because Twitter saw that Facebook's IPO went poorly, in the sense that the stock price went down. And so they may be concerned about how they may fare in an initial public offering, because Twitter doesn't have really great revenue. It doesn't really have robust ads or anything through its Twitter feed. So maybe its best utility is as a service for Apple and to be part of Apple. So, I mean, I think Apple could buy Twitter for, I don't know, like $30 billion maybe, or $10 billion. I don't know. So it's a thought. I mean, I don't think Apple wants to pay more than $30 billion for Twitter. Apple has about $100 billion saved up, and that's a lot of money for a company like Twitter that doesn't really have gigantic revenue. So we'll have to see, but it's definitely a thought, that Apple should consider maybe buying Twitter. Okay, so one of the coolest things that I've seen come out this week is something called Leap. And we all know, like, for example, that you can use sort of arm motions and stuff with the Kinect attachment to the Xbox. But this company that operates at leapmotion.com has revealed a $70 device, and they show it being used with an iMac, where you're going to be able to use sort of hand gestures in the air above this device to control a computer. Now, this is really cool. There's like a little video. I can show you a little bit of the video introducing the Leap. And it looks like this very simple, well-designed device. And you have to wonder, does Apple want... does this company want to be purchased by Apple, because they're using an iMac and they're showing the device has a sort of brushed metal look of like an iMac. But the cool thing is that you can control all sorts of functions on the computer just by holding your hand up over this device and swiping your hands around. You can swipe the window. You can turn things on the screen in terms of games. You could use shooter games where you use your hand out like you're shooting. You can draw just by swiping your hand around. And it looks really cool. It's only $70. You can own it, pre-order it ahead of time. You can order now, pre-order the Leap now. Imagine interacting with your computer in an entirely new way. And also it has like an API for developers to use. And let's see, they have a Q&A area that's kind of interesting. It says here, say goodbye to your mouse and keyboard. Leap represents an entirely new way to interact with your computer. It's more accurate than a mouse, as reliable as a keyboard, and more sensitive than a touchscreen. For the first time, you can control a computer in 3 dimensions with your natural hand and finger movements. Now, they say that they're much more responsive than the Kinect. It says this isn't a game system that roughly maps your hand or movements. The Leap technology is 200 times more accurate than anything else on the market at any price point, just about the size of a flash drive. The Leap can distinguish your individual fingers and track your movements down to 1/100th of a millimeter. So this is pretty wild. I mean, they say that this is like day one of the mouse, except no one needs an instruction manual for the hands. And it goes on to say, get ready, get set, go. We ask one simple question, what feels natural? Using a Leap is easy. And the next thing you know, a swipe in the air leads to a swipe on the page. So that nice LED display remains clean and untouched as it should be. You plug the Leap into a USB port, load the Leap Motion software, do a quick wave to calibrate, that's it. In minutes, you'll be able to interact with your desktop. It says, it sounds too good to be true, we know, but that's why we specialize in around here. So this is pretty cool. I mean, if this works, Apple should just buy this company immediately. It says, we are changing the world. 200,000 or 300,000 lines of code later, we figured out how to use the Leap to create an interaction space around your computer in 3D, able to distinguish thumbs from fingers and even handheld items like pencils. This allows users to interact like never before using only natural movement. And it says you'll be able to create custom gestures that fit how you want to use your computer. You can even network more than one Leap device to create even larger interaction areas. It says we've been able to link Leap to dozens of applications and operating systems, but this is just the beginning. So this is really, really cool, and I think, I think this type of technology could really change things. It says artists and creative types can use the Leap to emulate a stylus or easily create 3D images. Anyone can use the Leap to interact with Windows 7, 8, or Mac OS X by clicking, grabbing, scrolling, and using familiar gestures like pinch to zoom. So I don't know. I don't know if you can still pre-order this. I'm kind of interested in getting this. It's $70 total cost with ground shipping, and it's gonna ship in December 2012 or January 2013. So it's pretty far off. Hopefully this isn't hopefully it's not a scam of some sort. It's backed by serious investment firms like Anderson Horowitz and Highland Capital and SOS Ventures. So looks like it's a legitimate company. So it's called leapmotion.com. Leap. So check it out. Okay, so that's it for episode 116 of the Apple Podcast. This is Lex at Max Future. And again, you can help support this podcast by giving it a positive review in the iTunes store. So thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This has been a Max Future production.